Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual discussion on the new book from Convergence Magazine and OR Books, Power Concedes Nothing, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections. My name is Alex Hahn. I'm the executive editor of Convergence Magazine. We're a magazine for radical insights, formerly known as Organizing Upgrade. We work with organizers and activists on the front lines of today's most pressing struggles to produce articles, videos, and podcasts, and now books that sharpen our collective practice, lift up stories from the grassroots, and promote strategic debate. Our goal is to create the shared strategy that's needed to change our society and the world. I also happen to be a contributor to our new book, Power Concedes Nothing, and I'll be facilitating this evening's discussion. Before we start, I want to give a big shout out to our audience watching live this evening on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Please feel free to introduce yourself and drop your comments and questions in the chat. We will do our best to engage your comments on air. If you haven't already, give a like and subscribe to this channel to see more great content like this. Our guests today are all contributors to Power Concedes Nothing. And I'm going to want to welcome Stephanie Greenlee, who's Executive Assistant to the Secretary-Treasurer at Unite Here, where she also leads work in the Immigration, Diversity, and Civil Rights Department, as well as the union's Black Leadership Group. Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party, and Rose Mendelson, Organizing Director of Seed the Vote. Now, this is a book that is at its core about a lot of work that went into the 2020 election. It is a book that kind of since its inception, after the insurrection on January 6th, has really become, I think, more and more important as it's come closer to its release. I think we've seen the stakes have gotten higher and higher as time goes on. I think it's like a truism. Every election time, people say this is the most important election. It's usually true, and I think in the last couple of years, we've seen kind of the issues that drove the work that went into the victories in 2020 really come under a very specific and particular attack. We've seen an enormous amount of kind of crisis in our communities around the country. We also know that this week we've seen the airing of a vicious attack on women, a vicious attack that is going to hit hardest, people who are the most marginalized in our community, women of color, working class women. We see the kind of authoritarian white nationalist agenda on the march. We see minority rule. In the ways that it's going to express itself in the courts. We've seen it express itself in state legislatures and in our Congress. And so we're obviously walking into this with a broad set of issues and topics that we want to discuss, but with the undercurrent of what's happening right now. And it really, the moment underscores the importance of the work that the people on this call and the others featured in the book are doing. With that said, 2020 as a year was a really difficult year. It was a difficult year, a defining moment, a difficult time for poor and working class people, for progressive movements in the US. We were hit with multiple pandemics, the pandemic of COVID-19 and the economic devastation that followed that, a sharpening of the climate crisis becoming really too big to ignore. The crisis of anti-Black police violence leading up to the uprising in defense of Black lives. We were dealing with an authoritarian president, a wannabe fascist who gave voice and power to white supremacist movements in the US and authoritarian white nationalist movements across the world. With the book Power Concedes Nothing, we're making an argument that not only did grassroots organizers and organizing play a key role in defeating Trump, in electing progressives to other offices, expanding the squad, building our forces electorally, but that work was made possible because of years of organizing on the ground, not just as a response to the hardships of 2020, not just as a response to the election of Trump in 2016. So we're going to hear from our panelists as they highlight the reflections that they offered in Power Concedes Nothing and give us a vision for lasting social change beyond the 2022 and 2024 elections. So Stephanie, let's start with you. In the chapter, Drawing from Our Knowledge, Fighting for Our Future, you talk about Unite Here members who work in some of the hardest hit sectors in the pandemic. Your members were impacted financially as well as physically, and the union also took an enormous hit. What motivated Unite Here members to get out on the doors despite being in the middle of a pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. I think it was at least two things. One was just the intensity of the circumstances, right? So the hospitality industry took a huge hit right away. We were almost immediately 98% laid off. And what that means is that people were, careening down a slope into food insecurity and housing precarity, getting kicked off of healthcare. And the situation was very, very desperate. And so we knew we had to go big, right? But we had known before the pandemic that we needed to go big on this political cycle to take out, to unelect Trump, basically. And but the intensity of that decision just got amplified when the pandemic hit. And so we were in a number of executive board meetings where we were trying to decide what to do, because 98% laid off means a big, as you said, hit for our union and its resources. And we were trying to figure out what to do with the money that we had. And there was a lot of grappling with what to do with it. Direct relief, still going on the political campaign. And we ultimately decided to go because we have a deep and, hard fought, hard won organizing culture in our union about taking on big fights. We're a little union, but we have a practice of kind of punching above our weight, of reaching for the big goal, of doing the thing that's actually going to make the difference, even if, like, on paper, the math doesn't add up about the resources. So this was the right reach goal, and we reached for it. But at the end of the day, and perhaps at the beginning, I do think that the real reasons why we went, why our members went, like, they have names, like our reasons have names. They have names like Arlene, right, who's a former hotel room attendant and grandmother born and raised in Philly. It's Nini, right, an immigrant from Guinea, West Africa, who was laid off from airline catering. It's Rob, right, a father of 5 in Philly. In Las Vegas, it was Lucella, right, a porter on the Las Vegas Strip who was fighting for her citizenship. It was Chad, a cook at the Las Vegas Strip, right, whose union health insurance, like, surely saved his wife's life, right, from diabetes and a stroke. In Phoenix, it was Lucia, a cook at the Sky Harbor airport, who was laid off without health care. And when she got unemployment insurance, it was $214 a week. It was Maricela, who had organized 800 of her coworkers in food service in Phoenix and had worked to remove Joe Arpaio, right? And in Philly, it was Faberna, a Haitian immigrant, cashier, a young woman who waited 7 months for a single dollar of unemployment in Florida. And Sabino, who was laid off and fell ill with COVID, was intubated for 2 weeks alongside his wife and survived that. Those were our members. Those were our canvassers. Those were the people who decided to choose to, fight and to, make total sacrifices for this. And our union is the kind of union who's going to get their backs in that. And that's what we decided to do.
Wow, that's really amazing, Stephanie, and a lot to dig into there. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just a reminder for our viewers, if you've got questions, please share them in the chat, and we'll work to get to those in the second half of our event. So now moving on to Maurice. Maurice, in your chapter, Protest Politics and Electoral Power, you talk about and give examples of the extensive, effective work of the Working Families Party in 2020. Now, a large part of the Working Families Party is getting involved in politics on a local level. How does that translate into a national campaign like 2020's presidential election?
Sure, and Alex, it's great to be here, and it's even better to be here with such esteemed colleagues who represent working people and grassroots organizations and social movements who are really on the front lines of the work that's necessary for us to be able to fight fascism and also advance the interest of our folks. So just really honored to be in this conversation. So yeah, The Working Families Party, our bread and butter is local politics. And that's driven by our theory. Our theory is that that local politics, local grassroots energy, local issues, local candidates, they bubble up to the top. So I mean, you could take a look right now. Greg Kazar was a successful candidate in a primary in Texas. Summer Lee is currently in a primary in the Pittsburgh area. What do they have in common? They were candidates, like on the municipal level, Summer on the statewide level in Pennsylvania. And so by focusing on the grassroots politics and local politics, either municipal or state politics, you're able to really build the pipeline of future progressive independent candidates. Number two, those candidates represent real constituencies, have real followings, have dedicated volunteers, have a true base. When they're on the ballot, that base joins them. In a general election where you might have Joe Biden on the ticket, and it's not a mystery, and it's not in any way a surprise, I think, for people to understand our politics. Joe Biden wasn't our first or second choice. He was the candidate who ultimately prevailed in the Democratic primary, and ultimately we endorsed him. But we understood that there were segments of our base that would not be super excited about Joe Biden, the candidate, but they were, and they are very, very excited about those candidates that they're deeply connected with and have real relationships with on the local level. So we think it's actually a critical piece of the puzzle to ensure that we have grassroots politics and grassroots elections and candidates that could articulate in authentic ways the aspirations of the people that they're most close with. We think that's one of the reasons why we're involved in primaries among many. We want to get in early, we want to build base early, and we want to drive that momentum all the way to a general election. And in 2020, we saw that in a number of places where we ran insurgent independent candidates running to the left of neoliberal candidates in the Democratic primaries, or even independent WFP candidates. For example, in the municipal race where Kendra Brooks ran as an at-large WFP only candidate against Democrats and Republicans. Our theory was if we ran Kendra and she won, her base in North Philly and broader Philly more broadly would be essential eventually, several years down the line when we would need those folks to be engaged and focused in defeating Donald Trump. And when you look at the margins in Pennsylvania and you look at the margins in a lot of states, it's hard to argue that those particular voters, those activists, those candidates, their contribution did not matter.
All right. Well, thanks, Maurice. And I think there's some more to dig into there in the second half. Again, for our viewers, if you have questions, please share them in the chat. Now we're going to go to Rose. Rose, in the chapter Fight the Right, Build the Left, you and your colleagues from Seed the Vote outline the background work that helped you play a critical role in the 2020 election, as well as the ways you had to be nimble and creative with your tactics. How are you at Seed the Vote thinking about your work differently headed into 2022?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I'll just say, first of all, that we, our first two door knocking partners in 2020 were Unite Here and WFP, and our volunteers were so inspired by the work that they got to do with both of your organizations. To my fellow panelists, so it's great to be with you tonight. And first, I would love to spend this first question just digging a little more to, why we decided to get into this fight in 2020 in the first place. And then I think we'll have a little bit more time to talk about 2022. So, Seed the Vote grew out of a group of Bay Area organizers who initially came together to talk about the impact that a Trump presidency was having on our local organizing work. And this feeling that the political moment we were in called for us to really reprioritize and shift some of our resources in support of this national fight that was impacting all of us. And I think, in some ways we saw it as solidarity work. We care what happens to one another across state lines and recognize that the impact of the presidency isn't the same for everyone. But we're also really clear that this is work that impacts all of us, regardless of where we are, especially when it comes to something like the antiquated electoral college system. When we're talking about that, to not invest in fights in other places outside of our own region, it wasn't making sense to us anymore. And obviously the subtext here is that there are, of course, many valid reasons to be wary of out-of-state volunteers and organizations doing that work when there's a long history of that being done in ways that undermine and undervalue the work of groups on the ground. But in that moment to say, we're going to do nothing when there are so many concrete resources, money, but also, people, organizers, activists with time and skills to offer, it just didn't feel like enough in that political moment for us. And so we felt like we had to try and figure out how, under the leadership of groups on the ground, how to roll up our sleeves and do what we could to be a part of that work. And obviously 2 of those groups who we were so lucky to work with were Unite Here and WFP. And I think in general, we felt like it was important for the left to be able to be building infrastructure and communication and trust and the will really to deploy resources where they needed to go, when they needed to go there to win these key battles against the right. And I remember specifically in early days, talking about being inspired by the labor movement on that front, and how workers from different work sites travel to support each other's membership drives. And, even though, of course, none of this is a new idea in a lot of ways, like you were saying, Alex, I think we felt like we were also seeing that the right is doing a lot of this, but that we weren't doing as much of this on the left, at least for those of us in our region where we started these conversations. We just felt like there was still this gap where there were people out there who felt that there was an urgent threat of a second Trump term, but they would be much less likely, similar to what Maurice was saying, would be much less likely to work directly for the Biden campaign than for an org, than to work, throwing down with an org rooted in working class communities of color that's working year round on issue-based campaigns and electoral stuff, trying to win the election and build power year round, long term. And so we wanted to help fill that gap along with so many of the other amazing groups that are already doing that work. And that's why we decided to build up this project.
All right, great. Thank you, Rose. And, I wanted to say to our viewers, if you're just joining us, welcome to Convergence Presents, a discussion of our new must-read book, Power Concedes Nothing, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections. It's a conversation with Stephanie Greenlee, Maurice Mitchell, and Rose Mendelson. My name is Alex Hahn. I'm the executive editor of Convergence Magazine, as well as a contributor to Power Concedes Nothing. I wanted to move into a few questions kind of for the group. And in a pretty short amount of time, you all, I think, there are a million questions, I think, that could be asked. Wanted to encourage others to drop questions in the chat as well, so we can get to those in the second half of this conversation. One of the bottom lines in all of these chapters is that kind of elections are not the end-all be-all in building power. They're one key tool, in making our multiracial democracy real. I'm curious about some of the broader movement work that's been happening over the last couple of years. And then I'm curious about a couple specific things as well. Stephanie, I want to go to you first. You talked, and I think really movingly, about some of the stories of your members who were really, really hit hard in 2020. I'm wondering first kind of what the broader situation is for the members of Unite Here, kind of on the job as we move into 22, and the way maybe that you've thought about your union campaigns, both in organizing, contracts, legislative fights, building from 2020 into where we are now.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks for that question. So right at the height of the pandemic and the industry shutdowns, as we said, we 98% laid off. At this moment, we're still about 40% laid off overall in the US and Canada. So still not at all recovered. And it's different in different markets, depending on, how hospitality and tourism is recovering, but about 48% overall. And we don't think that we're going to come all the way back, in part because disaster capitalism, right? Like the employers have realigned themselves in ways to like drive down quote unquote labor costs. And what that means is we've been in huge fights about recall and returning to work, about staffing levels. Perhaps, the banner fight around that is around daily room cleaning in hotels, where we're seeing a little bit, we're seeing a lot, right, of hotels sort of trying to move toward the elimination of automatic daily room cleaning, which would jeopardize many hundreds of thousands of women of color and largely immigrant women's work. And so we're in that struggle, and we've always done in terms of recovery, right, and recall. And then we've never been a union that organizes for politics. We've always been a union that does politics for organizing, right? To try to expand the kind of favorable conditions for workers to be able to, in their shops, in their neighborhoods, right, in their lives, organize for more dignity, more power, respect, more resources for themselves and their families. And so we're in that struggle broadly still, and will be forever, because that's what it's going to take. And so, we've tried to really identify where the political landscape and the organizing opportunities and where our members are, really focusing on developing leadership of color in our union, right? Just completely clear and committed to the fact that if there's going to be a recovery, if there's going to be a just recovery, working people of color have got to lead it. So we're really investing in that along the way as well. And there's probably things I'm forgetting because there's a lot of things in motion. But in some ways we are smaller than we were. In some significant ways we are smaller than we were before the pandemic, and the hill to climb is steeper. But as I said before, when I think about our members and their stories and how they fight, how they're willing to fight, and the culture of our union being willing to take on really huge campaigns and really reach for the thing that's going to matter, like therein lies my hope, right? And then therein lies the possibility.
Yeah, and I'll also just kind of editorialize a little bit. I was remembering back, and this will, like date me in a specific way, but to the wake of 9/11, thinking back also to the economic crisis of 2008, that I, like, having spent a lot of time in the labor movement, close to different locals, members and leaders of Unite Here, those were huge shocks to the system as well. Not as thorough and as broad as the pandemic, but certainly a resiliency in the membership, and a membership that tends toward being forced to be resilient in life anyway. I do want to kind of like ask that question in a little bit of a different way to Maurice about how the Working Families Party has been engaging. I know you talked a little bit about like some of the primary battles that are happening now, connecting some of those local electeds who are jumping into primaries. But what is the other organizing work that Working Families Party has been engaged? What are some examples of some other organizing work that WFP has been engaged in the last couple of years?
Sure. So, WFP, our organizational form is, we're a political party, right? We live inside of this very rigid two-party duopoly, but we're an independent political party. And in some states, we have ballot access. The reason why I say that is that we're not simply involved in politics come election time. We're a political party 365 days a year. So that could look like many, many different things. At the height of the movement wave following the murder of George Floyd, we sprung into action all across the country to align with and to be in service of the movement for Black lives. We feel as a political party, we are the electoral expression of left social movements. And when social movements are at their height, it's our job to use our institution, our capacity, our our list, in order to elevate that movement, in order to discipline the political class to respect the movement, and then to figure out how to electoralize the movement gains and to secure movement gains through elections and then through governance. And so, you could look at, at the height of the movement, the primary in the Bronx of Westchester that ultimately led to the victory, the victory against a long-term right of center incumbent, saw the opportunity for us to express the politics of the movement electorally and demonstrate that the movement was ascendant. In St. Louis, we have a similar story.
Was that Maurice? Sorry, that was Jamal Bowman's district.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in Jamal's race, similarly in St. Louis, we have the municipal race in St. Louis. There's all these moments where we were able to electoralize and secure the movement gains, and later on we saw other elected officials that I don't think otherwise would have been seen as would have had the momentum to be victorious. The movement really, I think, ushered in those victories. The other thing, so that's a particular movement moment. But then after the movement, all of those folks were in motion, and we worked to create an electoral united front through the front line. And the front line was a collaboration with the Movement for Black Lives, United We Dream Action, Working Families Party, and other organizations in order to keep those folks in motion and have them play their highest purpose in election time and see electoral work as movement work, especially in the context of defeating Donald Trump. So we really try to see how we as a political party could play our position and our role in an ecosystem that includes social movements, labor institutions, grassroots organizations, and others.
All right, thanks, Maurice. And then from from a different perspective, Rose, the work of Seed the Vote, how have you all approached kind of building up toward 2022? And what are some of the things that you've learned from the work in 2020 or different ways of approaching the build up to the midterms?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, I think, in terms of being clear on our role in the work, we really are a vehicle to support these, and throw down for these key electoral fights. So in terms of our work in 2021, after we, joined our friends in Georgia to support that fight, it really looks like Seed the Vote volunteers, leaders, and staff all leaving and going to do stuff elsewhere. We're we all need to be doing all the work, and also not every vehicle is meant to do everything. And so, for us, we really just in 2022, and we were initially going to be a one-time project. That was the design. And so we did an assessment and reflection process around the work and our role in 2020 and made the assessment that this new political moment that we're in, we think we still can play a role in the fights ahead and in the elections ahead. And so I think in terms of approaching the work differently, a lot of it is just about trying to grow and build off of all the experiments from last time around. We had some creative experiments with building what we called seed pods, groups of friends and family who would make calls together. And we would love this year, knowing way farther out about door knocking plans, hopefully, because we don't have to wait last minute till we see Unite Here has a really on point COVID safe door knocking program and then jump in, with much more time to plan. We want to do a lot more door knocking. And also we want to think about how that relational recruitment that we did for on the phones, we can translate into on the doors too, and getting people to go, with their folks together to support some of these fights. And so that's one thing we're definitely thinking about. And we are thinking a little more long term too. I said, that we are thinking about building long term, but we were thinking short term for us specifically. And so now we're not just thinking about the midterms, but into the presidential and beyond. And I think there's a lot about messaging and getting people excited for the midterms to talk about in terms of what's different. But I think maybe that's a more specific question that's coming.
Well, I think we can move into that. And there is, And I think we can, the kind of like the events of the last couple of days, even setting those aside, right? There's a lot of people who are disappointed by inaction from the administration. A lot of people really waiting to see some of the change that was talked about. And I think, some frustration certainly in activists and organizers in our movements, about what has happened over the last few years. And this is really for the group. Like, how do we think about keeping base engaged? How do we think about keeping volunteers moving as we go into, harder and harder fights?
Well, if I can, I think this is where political education is so critically important. And this is something that I think the far right has executed really well over several decades. They had a demand that was not a proximal demand, and they understood they needed to build power in order to attain it. They knew they did not have a majority, and so they would have to build enough power to overcome the will of the majority in order to be in a position to overthrow Roe. And they systematically built the infrastructure where they were able to educate their base. So white evangelical Christians are 15% of the population, often 25% of the voting population. That distance, 15% of the population to 25% of the voting population, that is the political education that they were able to invest in. So that base understood voting for Republicans would lead to, over time, the conditions where they could get right-wing, ultra-right-wing Supreme Court justices in place, so that at a certain point they would have a majority in order to be able to advance their theocratic will, right? And so that is a very abstract and sophisticated electoral strategy over time that millions of people on the grassroots were committed to. We need to do the same on our side, so that, and in that journey, they had losses and wins, both issue losses and wins and electoral losses and wins, but they kept their eyes on the prize. Similarly, we need to develop that level of ideological and North Star clarity so that our forces, organizations, our activists, our leaders understand that we will experience setbacks, but we have to keep our eyes on the prize. That requires some ideological clarity and the investment in our leaders and in the grassroots to engage in the not just skills training, but the ideological and strategic training in order to be able to be grounded on that visionary sort of path that everybody needs to go towards in order for us to actually build the real power that we need.
Yeah, that's great. Any other thoughts, Rose and Stephanie, on that question of just kind of how we're moving, kind of given the situation on the ground, given where our people, where our base, where our activists feel like they are with the administration?
I have a couple of disjointed thoughts. I'm going to try to put them together, but like, in my experience in our union, disappointment is not the thing that scares me, right? Like, we're a union of people who have been pushed like down and into the margins, right, of the economy. Like, sometimes with feels like with the foot on our neck, right? We are a union of people who have survived over generations like chattel slavery. We are a union of people who have walk themselves across continents in search of a better life, or split the oceans in half, right? Because they want and dream and hope for something more. And when you're that kind of people, like, disappointment happens all the time. And it's not to normalize it, but it is a thing we can roll with. The thing that I think we're more, or that we're equipped to face down, because it's like, those are the conditions of our lives. I do think that the thing that's more alarming to me is, disbursement, right? Because what you learn when you organize workers in a shop is that you can't win a union without having a lot of people. And without having a lot of people who are different from you, you've got to have the housekeepers and you've got to have the banquet servers. You've got to have the baristas and you've got to have the line cooks. You've got to have them all, right? And what's striking to me about this moment is that, and so I think when it's like that and you train in that environment, which is where like what we do in our organizing culture, you learn that solidarity is in fact the thing, right, that can carry the day. It's like, right, almost as simple as solidarity forever, right? Like it is like the thing, right? It is how you have power. And it's how like our union and other unions become like an example of what like a real multiracial democracy can look like, right? Like in a shop, in a union. And it's a beautiful thing about what could be. And I think we're struck, and we've been talking with our canvassers and our workers, our members, about like how similar, right, the campaign to divide workers in a shop is so similar to what these like wedge issues and how they are, traded in, right, in this moment. Everything about everything is telling us not to trust a single other human. Don't trust them people, not those people. Don't talk to them people. Them people are like that. Those people are like that. Whatever, right? And you learn when you're organizing that like it's not true. When you go worker to worker, person to person, tell your story, right? Which is what we did on the doors all day, every day, like 6 days a week, right? Just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of doors doing that over and over again. You cut through all of that and you connect human to human and you build the kind of necessary power that can carry the day. And I actually think that like disappointment, like I know disappointment, right? Organizing is like the thing that we need to do and do more of, and on the doors, in the shops, in our neighborhoods, everywhere we can possibly be, just connecting with each other like that. And so I do think that's the way forward, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie, I'll just say that wasn't disjointed in the least. Very clear. I do want to take a second to welcome viewers who've just joined. If you are just joining us, welcome to Convergence Presents, a discussion of our new must-read book, Power Concedes Nothing, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections. We're in conversation with 3 contributors to the book, Stephanie Greenlee from Unite Here, Maurice Mitchell from the Working Families Party, and Rose Mendelson from Seed the Vote. My name is Alex Hahn. I'm the executive editor of Convergence Magazine, as well as a contributor to the book. Rose, I wanted to see kind of if you have a perspective on that question of how we keep that motivation moving, from your perspective at Seed the Vote, from your long history of organizing and activism as well.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm fired up from that take. And also just, it's getting me thinking, hearing you talk, Stephanie, about your members, and feeling like we can do disappointment, and like having built up that muscle. I think for some of our volunteers and leaders, we're still building up some of that muscle, at least in our relationship to the electoral work. Mm-hmm. And so I do think some of what Maurice was saying about like that North Star and being real about the path to power and what it's going to take to get there, I think that's a lot of where we're at too, and having some of those hard conversations. I would say, first of all, we're still figuring it out. Like we're talking to people, we're figuring out what's going to work to get people inspired and motivated and ready to go this spring, summer, and fall, and testing stuff out in the primaries and seeing how it goes. But so far, yeah, for our base, I think it's this both and of one, like not ignoring or lying how people are feeling and like honoring the disappointment and anger and sharing our own, because I think people can tell when we're BSing them in our messaging and how we talk about stuff, but also sometimes, yeah, like offering some alternative analyses about like what we're seeing and why. And I think one is about, again, yeah, that long-term path to power. And I do feel like I'm hearing a lot of groups talk right now about like the next 10 years, the next 5 cycles, not just because like we were never saying defeating Trump was going to do everything. And we're not saying if we win the midterms, it's going to do everything. But we are saying that if we spend the next decade, in addition to all of our other work, building this muscle and really doing the work of like pushing back the right on the, electorally, while also building and fighting for these shifts in the Democratic Party, that like we are going to win a lot of things. And I think some of those things are not necessarily even as far out as we think. Like I feel like there's a little bit of flattening of around the disappointment with the Biden administration of like, yes, there's been disappointments, and not everything has been Biden versus the progressives. Like, there are some ways he's been moved already, and some things that were very close to being won if it weren't for a few key Senate and House members who we need to deal with. And so we're actually like could be pretty close to winning some stuff, and like we can't stop now, so it's similar, I think, to what's been already said, but those are some of the things that we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie, just jump in.
I really appreciate that, Rose, both what you're saying and then the formulation, Maurice, you're putting out about the North Star, because I do think that both being clear about where we're trying to head, like what we're trying to win and like what it would take to get there. And I also think that like what you're saying about disappointment is complicated too, because we have won real things for our effort, for our trouble, right? Things are different. And I do think that's also a skill that we try to train on, is how to like actually disentangle what's the loss, what's the win, what's the like still to be won and still within reach kind of thing. Because, coming right off the Senate election, all of those early executive actions, like the COBRA extension, the stimulus, the child tax, like that was meaningful material difference win for our members, right? That like absolutely saved lives in that moment, right? Just the dire situation people were in. And so, yeah, there's more to go. And I don't mean to be dismissive about disappointment, but I think there's also a lot that we have won as well.
I'm glad you brought that up. The ARP was a progressive victory, and I don't think we take credit for all of the organizing that was done to position the Biden administration and as well as Congress to secure significant material relief to working people. Not a dollar of that money went to corporations or the wealthy. The child tax credit alone, it actually, you could measure the impact it had on decreasing the poverty rate,
yeah.
right? I mean, it's like that is not some sort of marginal victory. That is real, and I think it's important that we learn how to secure and honor the victories that we win, right? Simply because we didn't win the maximalist victory didn't mean we didn't win real material victories that working people are better off having. And so I think we need to be able to articulate why and when we win, and how our organizing and our electoral work led to those victories, why we need to continue to fight, what else is on the agenda, but also, declare and say with our chest, like this is a clear victory. And I think it's going to be important for us to be able to build that muscle.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I wanted to also encourage our viewers, if you've got questions or comments, please drop those in the chat. We've got about 16 minutes left, and we'll have time to get to some of those if folks have questions or comments. Just to follow up on that, and I'm just going to take some facilitator and contributor privilege here, but I do think that there's a way to think about victory. It's a victory that we're here to fight and to actually think about how to create a vision for the future. It's a victory that we're here, and watching kind of like these labor fights at Amazon and Starbucks. It's a victory, that we're here and still having this fight, for on the local level and in places around the country about how we're spending our revenue, why we're not taxing the rich. And all those victories, I think, Maurice, that you pointed to were things that kept us there. And so understanding, not just being able to message things as a victory, but what is a victory? There is not a two-step process to winning, the dictatorship of there's no two-step process to getting us to liberation. And if we think about it on a longer scope, and I've been really thinking, Stephanie, about some of the union organizing experience I have, the victory is not, are we going to get 75 cents or $1 an hour? The victory is, do you have enough power to force the boss to do something they don't want to do? And then you build on that once you're at that point. Because whether it's 75 cents or $1, that's not the thing that's going to change. It's going to have a good impact. It's an important thing, but that's not the thing that you're fighting for. You're fighting for much bigger questions.
Yes.
Yeah. So I did want to take a second, to kind of think about, and I want to make sure to do this. And there are plenty of political pundits in the world. None of them are on this video chat right now. None of them are in this live stream, right? And we're not trying to game out what is the impact of how the Roe v. Wade decision comes down, right? Oh, let's game out. What does this mean for the Democrats? What does this mean for the Republicans? That's not the perspective that I think any of us or the people watching have. But I do wonder, not about necessarily impact on our movement, because I think there are two core things, right? What does this mean for women today, tomorrow, 6 months from now, and a year from now? And what does this mean for the bigger project of white nationalist authoritarianism and rolling back rights for our people, rolling back rights for kind of in a broader way? And so again, it's not a question of how is this going to impact? Is this going to excite people? Is this going to demoralize people? Because number one, that's not the fundamental question we're dealing with. And number two, it's not a prediction we can necessarily make. But with this being very raw and very, very kind of new, having just come out in the last 48 hours, I do wonder how people are thinking about that impact and what is the impact on kind of the people that you're working with, and how are we going to think about moving forward, hopefully in a way that thinks about really centering, bringing these issues together in a clearer way over the next few years. Not to put out a really, I know it's a very simple question to answer. So, but just any thoughts that you all have, I think would be really valuable.
Okay, I'm really the first. Okay, sure.
I appreciate your step up, step back, brother.
Yeah.
Do it, Maurice.
Think about it for a second.
Yeah. Well, you asked a few questions there. Well, number one, we need to take the far right seriously. And at this point, the Republican Party is an authoritarian neo-fascist party, right? There are always authoritarian and neo-fascist elements in the Republican Party's coalition, but that element is now the leading element, and the party has been captured by that element. And they have a pretty revolutionary long-term vision that they're executing. They're not going to stop at Roe. And, the legal underpinnings of Roe have to deal with the right to privacy. And so whittling that down allows the far right to have hooks that they could use in order to undermine other rights and to be able to undermine the protections that other groups have. And they certainly will do that. So I think we could imagine that LGBTQ people could be in the crosshairs of this right wing court, and the overturning of Roe will give them the legal ammunition to do that, and so on and so forth. And I think what they've been constructing, right, is the tools so that they have control of the court and they have control of key legislatures. When those legislatures do things that are clearly unconstitutional, they'll just get kicked up to the Supreme Court again, and their right-wing compliant Supreme Court will give them a pass. So in some ways, it's a circuit breaker where they don't need majorities, where they could make minority rule a reality in this country. So this is like, now we're entering apartheid tactics. And this is not hyperbole. This is where we're going. And in 2022, this midterm election, this is why it's key. If they're able to win governorships, if they're able to win a majority in the House and Senate, which is one of the reasons why we're focusing so much on preventing them from doing that, they'll be in position to be able to steal an election in 2024, right? Now they narrowly attempted to steal the election last time, but if it wasn't for like paper thin sort of legal limitations and a few local officials that decided not to go with the plan, all of the laws that they've been passing in state legislatures have basically whittled that down to nothing. And if we're able to win those governorships, then you could imagine in 2 cycles, they could have trifecta control of the federal government, lock-in control and supermajorities of key states. And it would be hard to imagine, even though we're the majority, how we could easily, using elections and using majoritarian tactics, to be able to retrieve our democracy, which is why it's so critical that we act now. And in some ways, this ruling is like a shot across the bow for us. And I hope we can ring the alarms and not just think about the proximal loss with Roe, but the series of losses that will come if we don't deliver a strategy to block their next step, which is why we need to play chess. They're playing chess. We can't simply play checkers and focus on the last loss. We need to focus on the next move.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Maurice. That's exactly. I knew there was going to be kind of like a way to think about that going forward that you could lay out. I do kind of think about building on that, like what are the ways that we need to think about this work going forward? We're getting closer to the close of our event this evening. But any other thoughts, Stephanie or Rose?
I mean, I think I'd just say that, like, to my mind and many other people's minds, right? Like, obviously, abortion is it's not only a women's issue, right? It's a human issue. It's a workers issue. It's a racial justice issue. It's an economic issue. It is like healthcare, because it is healthcare, right? And I think the way that, to Maurice's earlier point about the long game, the long strategy about how to use this issue as a very powerful wedge. I'm sure some of it for some people is ideological and it's actually about a disagreement about what to do, right, with pregnancy. But it's also been wielded, right, as a political tool and a strategy, again, to that like very effectively divides people. And I just like go back to the organizing and the organizing lessons again and again and again, right? And that the only way out of this, I think, is like whole humans talking to other humans about their stories and about their lives and building power together and deciding to throw in together in some way, even beyond disagreement, right? And we have like, to hold a union together, like Unite Here, like we got all kinds, right? Our people come from, right, 170 different countries and speak over 40 languages, right? Unite Here International Union. We have all sorts of political viewpoints, all sorts of, right, like backgrounds and experiences and all of that. And you got to hold the thing together, and you can still hold the thing together and point it in the right, in an agreed upon direction. And we're not doing that in the kind of like at all like national conversation, but you can do that in the ground, on the doors, in the shop, in the neighborhood, right? And that's where we, like, I think, got to root our action to really build toward the kind of solidarity, again, that can like, make it a democracy, a union, a vision of a future that works for all of us. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I do want to recognize we've got about 5 minutes left. Rose, I don't know if you had something on that. I've got a little bit of a closing question that I wanted to pose to all three of you. And it really is like, what is one thing that you're thinking about differently in your work headed into 2022? What is one thing that you'd like to leave our viewers, leave the audience with out of here headed into 2022? And anybody can jump in if you're ready to go. But Rose, you want to jump in?
I can start on this one. Yeah, one thing, it's hard to just pick one, but I think I am inspired by who I'm talking with today to say, like, one thing we're really thinking about is really just about getting on the doors, and just like can't underestimate how amazing it felt last time during like this time of extreme isolation to actually be in person talking to humans, and also learning from like amazing door knocking strategy around doing really intensive follow-up that was just felt like we were like, oh, this is it, this can help make the difference, and it felt so tangible and real and amazing. So I think one thing we're thinking about is just how can we crank that up and do as much as possible to bring as as many people along to knock on doors with our amazing partner orgs, and we can't wait to do that.
Great. Stephanie, one thing you're thinking about differently?
Same, Rose. Ready to get on the doors. I feel like that's where we're at, right? Like, and that's not necessarily a new thing, right? We built our 2020 political program out of like, a lot of decades of work. But I think like we really, because we had to pull that thing off, like got way better at it, right? This last cycle. I mean, we just learned so much about how to be talking with canvassers, about like power and like what it takes to win it and like how to use it and like how to, we were really like focused on leadership development and training people. People came out of, the last cycle, like totally transformed, went back in their shops and like organized whole new shops, right? Like we just, just completely transformed our capacity. So I do think what we're thinking about, if I could take two things, one is like really just digging in a little like more and earlier on the leadership development pieces, right? And like how to like come out of this, not just with like an electoral victory, but like real capacity victories, right? And a whole new leadership like layer. And then two, like just really having more partners and just like bringing more people like y'all with us, right? Because like we were like, we were out there like alone early, and we were just like, and we know that more is possible with more partners. And so we're really, out there trying to do that and raise the money earlier and, get all the teams and the groups in place in a way that could really make the difference. And so, yeah, like that.
Maurice, you're muted.
Rose and Stephanie, I mean, you all it's music to my ears to hear that. I always say, like, when in doubt, grab a clipboard and knock on some doors. When you're confused about which direction to go, knock on some doors. And the other piece on top of just the tactic of knocking on doors, which I think is so fundamental, being in conversation with actual working people in your community. But the second thing that you mentioned, we need to build a base. And I hope for an organizing renaissance in our movement. We get back to the basics of building a strong base that then we could build other things on. But those other things can't stand without a foundation of a strong, ideologically aligned, deeply cared for base that understands what the marching orders are and what the stakes are.
That's fantastic. So just to summarize that, I really think those were some really clear, yes, knock on the door. Thank you, Stephanie. We're gonna knock on doors. We're gonna keep building that base. But I thought, Stephanie, your point about leadership development, and that goes broadly, I think, across our movements in a lot of ways. And I really think that is a fantastic way to end this event. So I want to thank the three of you again. My name's Alex Hahn. I'm executive editor of Convergence Magazine. I've been joined by some of the contributors from Power Concedes Nothing, Stephanie Greenlee from Unite Here, Rose Mendelson from Seed the Vote, and Maurice Mitchell from the Working Families Party. I want to thank our viewers on YouTube and Facebook. I want to give you one last reminder to click the link to follow and subscribe, whether it's on YouTube YouTube or Facebook to Convergence. And we're going to be spending a lot more time over the coming weeks and months discussing the lessons from the book, Power Concedes Nothing, and how it's going to be applied this year and going forward as we look to really building this movement and building power for working people. So again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.